If you're looking for trouble on your computer, one of the last places we're going to be looking is on your onboard firmware. This stuff is like a tank, and as long as you don't abuse it, I've had thousands of systems that I've serviced that over their entire life, I never ever once had to deal with problems with the BIOS. I've gone into BIOS, gone into system setup a lot, but in and of itself, it's pretty safe stuff. Now, before we dive too deeply into some of the problems we do run into with firmware, the first thing I want to do is talk about a little bit of terminology, because people use the words like UEFI and CMOS and firmware and BIOS and all these different words, and I just want to make sure we're good and tight on this, because the problem we run into is that this stuff's been around so long that we're kind of suffering from things that were true 30 years ago even today. Let me give you an example. First of all, here's a picture of one of the first firmwares on any motherboard ever made. You'll notice that it's two chips. One of these chips, the shiny looking one, that chip is actually what we call a double EEPROM. It's a programmable read-only memory. So it's made once at the factory, they snap it into the motherboard, and that never changes. So if you ran a system setup, you had to use that other chip. This other chip is known as a real-time clock with a built-in, you ready, complementary metal oxide semiconductor, or CMOS. So back in the old days, when we made changes to the BIOS through our system setup, we updated that particular little chip there. And by the way, that chip could only store about 64 bytes, not 64K, only about 64 bytes. It's gotten a lot bigger over the years. So today, we don't have these double EEPROMs and separate CMOS chips. Today we have single flash ROM chips. Flash is a type of ROM it's ROM, so it's read-only memory, but it has one big benefit, and that is we can flash it or reprogram it if we want to update that built-in BIOS. So that's actually kind of a cool feature. But I do want to talk about one vestige that's still around, and that is the real-time clock. We still need clocks in computers. Clocks are absolutely critical. In a Windows network, for example, all of the computers in the network need to be very closely, and I mean within milliseconds, synchronized to the same time, or they won't even boot up. There's all kinds of situations on the internet where really, really precise time is absolutely critical. And the thing that's keeping the time on these zillions of computers is, well, there's no longer a big physical separate chip, but the real-time clock still very much exists. And that's great, except for one problem. Chips need electricity. So if chips need electricity, what do we do when the computer's turned off? Well, for one thing, a lot of computers, the power supply will still supply a little bit of electricity to the motherboard, but what if we unplug the thing? In that case, we fall back on something that's as simple as a battery. Every motherboard on Earth has a battery built into it, and I want to show you the battery on this system right here. So as we take a look in here, hold on a minute, I'm going to have to dig it up where the battery is. Oh, hey. The battery is buried deep, deep underneath my big video card. Luckily for me, I've got a backup system we can take a quick peek at here. And what I want you to do is take a look on this system and let me show you the battery. That is pretty much the type of battery you see on all but the smallest motherboards. This is what we call a CR2032. These batteries have been around forever, and you've got to have a good battery in your system or a couple of very negative things are going to happen. Negative thing number one, you're going to lose your time, or the time's going to slow down. And all of a sudden you come up to your computer and it's about an hour later than the current, well, not exactly an hour, that might be a daylight savings time issue, but let's just say it's 20 minutes behind. That is one symptom of a battery that's slowly running down. The other thing that you can run into on a lot of systems is that if the battery dies, all of your system information that you've updated through your system setup, it just disappears. All of a sudden your computer says, I have no hard drives, and all of my settings are set to defaults, and any passwords or anything like that I might have put in earlier have disappeared. So if these types of situations take place, you need to snap in a new battery. These can be a nefarious problem because so many new systems today will keep everything powered as long as you're plugged into a wall. And suddenly somebody takes their desktop because they got a new office and they move to a new office, they unplug their system and they put it on a hand truck, they go up there and all of a sudden everything's gone nuts. A lot of times it's nothing more than about a $2 battery that you just need to snap in there. I usually keep a few of these batteries around just because on systems it does show up as a problem from time to time. So be aware that a bad battery can wreak havoc on today's systems. Now, the next thing I want to take a look at is over here. So I've got this cute little device here. Doctor's orders, ignore this. Okay, don't ignore it. What we're doing here is we're actually capturing what you guys are seeing right here. This is capturing it. I'm just using this so I can see where I'm going. So kind of a cool little device too. So anyway, let's take a look here on my system. Now there's a couple of things I want to talk about here. The biggest problem we run into with BIOS is people coming in here and jacking with settings that they shouldn't be messing with. Now, I'm also going to tell you that mess with settings. It's important. The cool thing is that on all of these screens, somewhere, usually you hit F10, and it will sit there and say, do I want to save anything? And if I don't want to save anything, I can just hit cancel. What I'm telling you is you can come in here and you can play with this stuff, have fun, but just don't save anything. So many times I've worked on a system and there's some system setup setting I'm not familiar with. I'll just goof with it a little bit, see what the different options are, and if I don't like what I'm seeing, I can always just set it, just not even save it, and then I'm in good shape. The other thing you'll see on most of these systems is some form of setting, and in here it's right here, and what this says is, look, I don't know what I'm doing in here. Please give your best shot of what you think is okay, and it will go ahead and just set it up for you. On this particular one, I've got normal, extreme, that's not a good idea, fast. So what I can do is I can pick one of these, especially if you've been tweaking with stuff and suddenly your computer isn't booting up and you know it's your fault because you were the one who was in your system setup messing with stuff. Here's where you can go in, just set it back to say normal. On a lot of these system setup screens, you'll see something that'll say something like base defaults or bare minimums or something like that, and you just play with that and you're okay. Oh, here, look right down here at the bottom. You see where it says defaults? So if I click on that, if I've made any changes, it'll just go back to system defaults and the computer will at least be able to boot up. Okay, now the other thing I want to talk about here, let me go back into advanced mode. Now, keep in mind, folks, BIOS's system setup screens are very different. On this particular one, I'm using an Asus brand BIOS, but the system setup screens can look very different. In fact, I've got some pictures. So let me put up a couple of pictures of different system setups that might give you an idea of how very different these types of screens can look. So look at these, and as you see them, notice that just because they look very different, they're still going to have basically the same settings. So don't get hooked on looking at this screen and thinking that this is the only way that system setups look. Okay, so the last thing I want to talk about, and this is probably one of the scariest things that you're ever going to be doing with these guys, is going through a process called flashing. Flashing simply means that you're going to update all the firmware on that flash chip that's on your motherboard. If there's one way that you can turn a $300 motherboard into an ashtray, it's by doing this improperly. So a couple of really important rules. Make sure that you're not going to run out of electricity while this process takes place. Me, I use an uninterruptible power supply. We've got an entire episode on power supplies. We'll talk about that type of stuff in another episode. But number one, make sure you have good power, okay? Number two, make sure that you have a complete copy of a flash update. These are files, and you download them usually from the motherboard manufacturer, and you bring them down, and then make sure you know why you're doing it. A big reason that we will flash a BIOS on a motherboard is, let's say, a new type of CPU. This is an i9 chip in here, and so a new type of i9 comes out in a few months. It's got a little bit faster speed. This motherboard should probably be able to handle it, but because it didn't know about that new kind of i9, we usually have to flash it so that it'll accept faster processors. That's just one example of thousands of reasons that we will go ahead and flash BIOSes. So you don't flash a BIOS just because there's an update. You read what it's all about, and then you make a decision as to whether you want to do it or not. This is serious stuff. In fact, it's so serious that a lot of motherboard manufacturers will put 2 BIOS chips on the motherboard. That's just in case you screw one up. At least you'll be able to recover the system from another BIOS chip. So this one doesn't have that, so I better get it right the first time. So what I'm going to do is I'm either going to have a BIOS update which manifests as a file, and I'm going to either plug it in as a thumb drive, or on this one actually has a feature where I can go ahead and just say via the internet, and you'll notice what it says here, warning, warning, warning. It's got all kinds of warnings in here. So I'm just going to go ahead and click yes, and then we're going to let that guy go. So flashing is an important function that we will do on our systems. It's invariably going to be done. There could be bugs that can show up, and the manufacturer needs to flash your BIOS to fix a bug. It's often done as a way to update BIOSes to accept new technology. Faster RAM and faster CPU are a big one. But even other technologies, for example, faster and faster USBs have required firmware updates as well. You go to the manufacturer, you go to their website, you look up your motherboard, and you look at what flash updates it has, you read the updates, and you decide for yourself whether you want to use them or not. You make your call, because there's nothing worse in the world than doing some flash, your power goes out halfway through the flash update process, and there is absolutely no way to recover that motherboard.